So this video is not so much about how to multiply and divide. You know, before the 7th grade, you should have learned multiplication tables at least through 10. I always like to go at least to 13. I've learned to 15 because it really does help me as I became later and later in my math career. But a 7th grader should definitely know 1 through 10 on the multiplication tables by heart. You know, it saves you the trouble of having to kind of like count on your fingers. 5 times 3 is 5, and then 10, and then 15. You don't want to have to do that, add all the time. It's easier if you have it memorized. This video is also not about how to do long division or long multiplication. All I'm focusing here is how to actually operate the signs of the numbers, because that's what's new right now. So basically, if there's no negatives involved in the problem, all you have is positive numbers. That's what you've always done so far. Your answer is always going to be positive. But if there are negatives involved, you have to think about it. You have to operate the sign anytime the negatives are involved. If there is a pair of negatives, anytime there is sets or pairs of negatives, every two negatives that you put together will cancel each other out. So an even number of negatives results in a positive answer. But if a negative is alone, it doesn't have another negative to pair itself with, then you can end up with a negative answer. That means if there's a negative number or an odd number of negatives in the problem, the answer is negative. Okay? So here's an example of that. So if you do 3 times 2.5, your answer would be 7.5. But because there's one negative in this problem, just one, then it's an odd number of negatives. The negative is by itself, and so the answer is negative also. If you do half times 3/4, and we'll talk more about how to multiply fractions again in a different video, you should get 3/8. But because there's only one negative in that problem, the answer is again negative. How about here? -4 times -3. By the way, remember, here's another way of writing multiplication, right? So you can write multiplication without actually writing the sign at all. Remember, if there's no sign, multiply. So if there's a number in the parentheses like this, there's a multiplication implied over there. Okay? So either way, 4 times 3 is just 12. But because there are two negatives, they pair up. It's an even number of negatives. The answer is positive. So the way I think about this is that one negative cancels out the other. So what is the opposite of going left? It's going right on the number line. That's how I think of it. If I take away a negative velocity, I'm actually adding positive velocity. It's the way of thinking about it, right? So if here on the other hand, if I'm doing 3 times a negative number, that's adding a negative number 3 sets of times. Of course, you're going to end up with an even more negative number. So it makes sense that positive times negative makes negative. And it makes sense that negative times negative makes positive. Because remember, negative is like doing the opposite. So positive times negative, the opposite of that is negative. But the opposite of another negative is just positive. So let's do a few more examples to make sense out of that. To see that the same thing works with division too. -6 divided by -2 divided by -1. So if you just think about the numbers, it's 6 divided by 2 divided by 1, which is 3. But you also have to think about the signs. You have 1 negative, 2, 3. The first two can pair and cancel each other out, but that leaves 1 negative by itself. It's an odd number of negatives in the problem, and therefore your answer is going to be negative once again. If you do 1/4 divided by 1/8, so 1/4 divided by 1/8 is the same thing as 1/4 times 8 over 1, which is 8 divided by 4 or 2. Okay? But because the point is, and we're going to review how to do this later also, but the point is, since there's no negatives in the problem, obviously the answer is positive. Here's one more example. We got -4 divided by -2 times -3. So again, we have 3 sets of negatives, right? And so division and multiplication, it applies. The answer is going to be negative. But if I divide by another -1, now I have 4 negatives total. An even number of negatives makes it positive. So 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives, final answer is positive. And then you just think about the numbers. 4 divided by 2 is 2, times 3 is 6, divided by 1, still 6. And so that's how you do it. And remember, if there's no sign, multiply. There's multiple ways to represent that multiplication. In fact, all of these over here are actually saying the same thing. This is 6 times 8, this is 6 times 8, and this is 6 times, oops, not 3, 8, right? So all of these are different ways to represent multiplication. There are, by the way, several different ways to represent division also. You can do, let's say I was doing 6 divided by 8. I can do it like this, 6 divided by 8, which is the one I use in these problems. But this is also division right here, the fraction sign. So technically, this is also 6 divided by 8. You will sometimes see it written like this too, 6 divided by 8. And you can even see it like this, right, where you do 6 divided by 8. With the 8 here and a 6 here. All of these are equivalent representations of division as well. Just wanted to put that in there because it will show up throughout the year. Well, you have to recognize all of those as division. Okay? All right, so hopefully that makes sense to you. And I will see you in the next video where we're going to be talking about more details with rational number arithmetic.